4 miles above Germany. In the freezing, roaring cockpit of a heavy bomber, a man is holding a formation together as the sky around him comes apart. It is 1944, and the anti-aircraft fire is bursting in black flowers all around the aircraft, and enemy fighters are slashing through the bomber stream, and planes to the left and right of him are falling out of the sky in flames, each one taking 10 men down with it. He holds his course, steady, calm, doing the coldest and most dangerous work of the entire air war, leading other men through it by the simple fact of not flinching. And here is the thing that no one flying near him could possibly know, the thing that makes this ordinary act of courage extraordinary. This pilot, gripping the controls of a shaking bomber over the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, is, back home, the most beloved and famous man in America. He does not want anyone to know it. He has fought harder to be in this cockpit than almost anywhere he has ever been in his life. Before we go on, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now back to that bomber over Germany and to the famous man who fought his way into the most dangerous seat in the war. To understand what he did, you have to understand what he gave up to do it. He was a movie star, and not just any movie star, but perhaps the best-loved actor in the country, a man whose face filled theaters, who had just won the highest award his profession could give. When the war came, the safest and easiest path in the world lay open to him. His country would happily have kept him at home, making inspiring films, appearing at Bond rallies. His fame turned into a weapon far from any danger. That is what almost anyone in his position would have done, and no one would have thought less of him for it. He refused it. He wanted to fly and to fight, and he was willing to give up the safety his fame guaranteed him to do it. His name was James Stewart. And the same year he had won an Academy Award and stood at the very top of Hollywood. He had also quietly gone to war, and by 1944 he was flying combat missions over Germany as a bomber pilot in the 8th Air Force. Everything you are about to hear is documented in the records of the Army Air Forces, in his own service file, in the accounts of the men who flew with him. It is not a studio's invention. Jimmy Stewart, the most famous man in America, really did fly into the deadliest air campaign of the war, and really did lead other men through it, and really did come home so changed by it that he could hardly bring himself to speak of it for the rest of his life. By 1940, Jimmy Stewart was one of the biggest stars in the world. Tall, lanky, with that unmistakable hesitant drawl, he had become the very picture of a certain kind of decent American everyman, and audiences adored him. That year he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was at the absolute peak of a career most people can only dream of. Wealthy, famous, beloved, with every door in Hollywood open to him. He was also, unlike most of his colleagues, something else. He was a serious, experienced pilot, a man who had fallen in love with flying and logged hundreds of hours in the air on his own time and his own money, long before his country needed pilots. And when the country did need them, he did not wait to be asked. In 1941, before America had even entered the war, Jimmy Stewart tried to enlist. He was rejected. He was tall and very thin, and he came in under the minimum weight the Army required, and they turned the biggest star in Hollywood away for being too skinny. So he worked to put on weight, and he tried again, and this time he got in, one of the first major American movie stars to put on a uniform, walking away from the height of his fame to become a private in the Army, at a moment when he could have stayed exactly where he was. His flying was not a hobby he had picked up for show. Stewart had earned his pilot's license years before the war, had gone on to earn a commercial rating, had bought his own airplane, and had logged hundreds of hours crossing the country on his own time, a genuinely accomplished aviator at a time when flying was still difficult and dangerous. When he put on the uniform, he was not a celebrity pretending to be a pilot. He was a real one, skilled enough that the Army immediately saw the value in him, which was exactly the problem, because a skilled pilot who was also a national treasure was precisely the kind of man the Army wanted to keep safely behind a desk or a training aircraft, far from the guns. The Army, however, was not stupid about what it had. It had, suddenly, one of the most recognizable and beloved men in the country in its ranks, and its first instinct was the obvious one, to keep him safe and use him. He was a pilot, so they put him to work as a flight instructor, training other pilots, stateside, far from any danger. His fame and his skill both employed in a role from which he was very unlikely ever to come home in a box. It was sensible safe. It was exactly the kind of war a famous man was supposed to have. And Jimmy Stewart hated it and pushed against it, again and again, because it was not what he had signed up for. He wanted combat. He wanted to be sent where the fighting was, to do the actual dangerous work, and he lobbied and requested and pressed until, finally, the Army relented and sent him where he had been asking to go. In late 1943, he arrived in England as a B-24 Liberator pilot with the 8th Air Force, assigned to a bombardment group, one more pilot among thousands, except that this one had an Oscar on a shelf at home. He had gotten what he wanted. What he wanted turned out to be the single most dangerous job in the entire American war effort. So he waited and pushed for the better part of 2 years. From 1941 into 1943, while the war raged across 2 oceans, Jimmy Stewart trained other men to fly and did not fly into combat himself, and it ate at him. He was older than most of the young pilots coming through, already in his mid-30s, and he knew the clock was running, and he knew the war might pass him by entirely, leaving him having worn the uniform without ever having done the thing he joined to do. He requested transfer after transfer. He made himself, politely and relentlessly, impossible to keep on the sidelines, until at last the army gave in and cut him orders for a combat group bound for England. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was a slaughter, and everyone who flew it knew it. The bombers went in daylight, in tight formations, deep into German airspace, and the German defenses, the flak batteries and the fighter squadrons, were waiting for them, and they exacted a horrifying toll. For long stretches of the war, the odds of an 8th Air Force airman surviving his full tour of missions were worse than even. Men did the arithmetic and understood it. Every time the bombers took off, some of them were not coming back, and everyone aboard knew it might be them. Into that, by his own insistence, went the most famous man in America. Stewart flew roughly 20 in Germany, and he did not merely ride along. He flew as a command pilot and a formation leader, one of the men responsible for leading whole groups of bombers to the target and back, which meant flying out front, setting the course, holding steady while the flak found the range, so that the planes behind could follow. It was leadership of the purest and most frightening kind, and by every account he was superb at it, calm under fire, meticulous, deeply respected by the men who flew with him, who quickly stopped seeing the movie star and saw only a good officer who knew his job and shared their danger. He rose through the ranks fast, from private eventually to colonel, and he earned all of it in the air. He also carried what such men carry. The enemy pilots who rose to meet the bombers were skilled and brave, and doing their own country's desperate work, and the flak gunners below were defending their own cities and families, and none of that made the missions any less terrifying or the losses any less total. Stewart watched bombers full of men he knew go down. He led missions from which planes he had briefed that morning did not return. He was responsible, as a leader, for sending men into that fire, and for the ones who did not come out of it. The strain of it worked on him the way it worked on all of them. Only he had further to fall, from a life of golden ease into the coldest reality the century had to offer. He flew from a muddy airfield in the English countryside, and he flew to the hard targets, the deep penetrations into Germany, where the defenses were thickest, the names that made airmen go quiet. He was decorated for it, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and other honors, not for being a star, but for leading missions well under fire. And as the months went on, he was promoted upward into the operations of a whole bombing wing, planning and directing the missions of hundreds of aircraft, a job with its own crushing weight, because now the men who did not come back were failing to return from missions he had helped to plan. He never stopped flying them himself, when he could. He was not the kind of leader who sent men where he would not go. By the end of it, Jimmy Stewart was not the man who had gone in. The friends and colleagues who saw him after the war were shaken by the change. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose. He was gaunt and grey and older than his years, and he carried the strain of the missions and the losses in a way that anyone who has been near real combat would recognize. What we would now call combat stress, the deep and lasting wound of having lived that fear and carried that responsibility and watched that many men die, he brought home with him, quietly, the way men of his generation were expected to. And he did the most telling thing of all. He refused to let it be used. The studios, of course, would have loved nothing more than to trumpet the war record of their biggest star, the Oscar winner who had become a real combat hero, and it would have been worth a fortune in publicity. Stewart forbade it. He would not allow his service to be turned into promotion. He almost never spoke of it publicly. For the rest of his very long life, he had not gone to war to make himself a bigger star. He had gone because he thought he should, and he came back and closed the door on it, and kept it closed. Those who knew him best understood that he never really put it down. For the rest of his long life, the war sat in him, private and heavy, surfacing only rarely and only to people he trusted. He had gone into it as a young man at the top of the world, and come out of it having seen more death and borne more responsibility for it than most soldiers ever do. And he carried that quietly through 4 more decades of movies and awards and adoration, never once cashing in the one experience that would have burnished his legend the most. The silence was not forgetting. It was the opposite. It was a man who remembered too well to ever want to perform it. His first film after the war was a small, strange picture that did only modestly at the box office when it came out, a story about a decent man named George Bailey pushed to the edge of despair, a man who has given everything for others and finds himself, one dark night, wanting to throw his own life away. Jimmy Stewart played him, and the desperation in that performance, the raw, cracking edge of it, is not entirely acting. It is a man who has been to the edge of the world and back putting something real on the screen. The film was called It's a Wonderful Life, and it would take years to become the beloved classic it is now. And the darkness at its center was played by a man who had genuinely been in the dark. He did not leave the service either. Long after the war, Jimmy Stewart stayed in the Air Force Reserve, kept flying, kept serving, and eventually rose to the rank of Brigadier General, becoming the highest-ranking actor in the history of the United States military. Decades after his combat tour in 1966, he even flew on a bombing mission over Vietnam as an observer, an old general who still would not stay entirely on the ground while other men flew. He carried the whole of it quietly, the fame and the war both, and let almost no one see the seam where the two met. It would be easy to tell this as a story about a celebrity doing his bit, and it is much more than that. What Jimmy Stewart did was refuse the single greatest advantage any man in that war possessed. His fame was a shield that could have kept him utterly safe, admired, celebrated, and entirely out of danger, and it would have been handed to him gladly. He threw it away. He fought to be allowed into the most lethal job the country had, led men into it, and paid for it with a piece of himself that he never got back and never once tried to profit from. The most famous man in America went to the war, and then he refused, for 50 years, to make himself famous for it. That is the whole story, and the silence is the heart of it. Anyone can be brave for a camera. Jimmy Stewart was brave where there was no camera, 4 miles up, in the cold and the flak, leading frightened men through the worst air war in history, and then he came home and would not be filmed talking at it, because to him it was not a performance, and never would be. He had a life of light and ease waiting for him, and he set it down and picked up the heaviest thing the century was handing out, and carried it, and then carried the memory of it quietly to the end of his days. We remember him for the movies, and we should. But the finest thing he ever did, he did in the dark, where no audience would ever see it, and then he kept it to himself, which is perhaps the most he could have done to honor the men who flew beside him and did not come home to any applause at all.